Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the second panel of day 2 of Reckoning and Repair. Hi, Rosin. Yeah, exactly. I'm Jeanne Vaccaro, and I'm the co-curator with Jennifer Doyle of Scientia Sexualis. This is the last weekend to see the show. If you haven't had a chance to go be with the exhibition, please take some time to do that. The museum is open until 6:30 tonight, I think. 6. And then tomorrow, please join us again for 2 more wonderful panels. One will be with the 2 artists who made the piece in the project room, Palomar, Schroedinger is a Woman, and then a closing conversation with Jennifer and I and C. Riley Snorton.
I just wanted to say, too, that we've been having kind of robust conversation and discussion. And so after Panteha and P staff, Panteha Abareshi and P staff present, we'll be opening up the floor to discussion and conversation. All questions are allowed, including questions that are building on things that have come up since yesterday and the previous panel. And there are bios for all the artists who are presenting as part of the symposium in an insert in the pamphlets on the chair, and so we encourage you to peruse them at your will, but we're going to let the artists speak for themselves and their work. And with that, we'll turn the floor over to you. Pete staff will be starting.
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. So my understanding is that Panteha and I are both going to give kind of overviews, introductions to our work. I'm just going to speak about the work that I have in the exhibition. There are naturally these like tendrils or tangential thoughts that come out of it. If I do end up talking about another work, I'll try and give a bit of an overview of what that is. I feel like this little bit of the day is like secretly the antagonistic panel. I don't know if Panteha would agree. So the 2 works that I have in the exhibition is a 16mm film and 2 photogram prints. The 16mm film is called Depollute. I'm going to be clicking through stills of that behind me. And the photograms are called Knife, Scalpel, Blade, and they're an ongoing series. I'll start with Depollute. So I made it in 2018, which feels relevant. It feels like a very different moment to now. But it was also in quite a particular continuum of where I was at in my research. It's a 16mm, I would call it a flicker film. It's also somewhat a poem text film. And for those who have already walked around the exhibition, you'll have noticed that it only plays on request. And so this was always, or like an early intention of the work. So, you can kind of see it through here, but there's a 16mm projector sat kind of inert in the gallery with a sign asking you to go and request to play the film. Upon going and finding someone, asking them to play it, what you see is about a 3-minute text. It flickers, it flashes, it has a sort of aggressive quality. But what it is an instructional text on how to perform a self-orchiectomy. And so an orchiectomy is the surgical removal of one or both testicles. In this instance, you're being guided through performing it on yourself. At this time, 2018, both as an artist researcher, but also in my own personal life, I was kind of interested in self-medding, forms of knowledge that circulate, particularly around transitioning, gender, but also other forms of autonomy, agency of the body, that were circulating outside of the parameters of the medical industrial complex or other kind of institutional realms. I mean, this could be something as simple as an ad hoc reading group. It could be something like teaching each other and passing hormones around outside of a hospital context. Or I was going towards this more extreme end of the spectrum, or extreme, which is people that were performing surgery on themselves. It's actually interesting too, I had brief moment of researching the One Archive of sort of early HIV newsletters, where people were also sharing ad hoc information about how to essentially abuse different pharmaceuticals to treat an illness that at that time was not being treated, right? So that gives a little bit of context historically also to how there is this lineage, there is this history of sharing information, self-medding, finding forms of bodily agency that are not top-down, that are not hierarchical, right? What was interesting about orchiectomy, I mean, it came up a little bit in Nicki's talk before for anyone that was here, that in the early 2000s, there were 3 nurses running a kind of orchie shed. You could informally go and visit this clinic, pay under like $500. And so it was like a self-run clinic, right? The self-orchiectomy online was something that was frequently discussed. And on message boards, these threads would always be deleted really quickly. I found academic journals where doctors were discussing, essentially debating this issue of self-surgery, were kind of arguing back and forth about whether or not surgical knowledge should be disseminated among the masses or whether it should be restricted so as to protect people. Something else that I found kind of compelling about this question of performing a self-orchiectomy was that it was often discussed as a way of forcing the hand of the medical institution. And so in a sense, if you begin a surgery, I really remember someone saying this on a forum, if you begin the surgery, they have to finish it for you. And so even if you end up losing so much blood that you have to go to the hospital, something goes wrong, this sort of thing, you are kind of guaranteed through a practice of care that this surgery will be completed to some degree. And what I found interesting about that was a kind of strategic element, right? If you are denied care, if you are not granted access to this, whether it's through insurance or whether it's through a psychological evaluation, or whether you just don't fit the criteria of someone that should or should not be given this surgery, you could essentially begin it and force the hand. And so this power play dynamic, I was really kind of excited by, I suppose. When it came to making the work, I gleaned information from message boards and that kind of thing before they could be deleted, before they could be censored or removed. I had a friend who was dating a doctor at the time, and we had a very uncomfortable dinner where I kind of pressed them and asked them, and at this point I had a draft of the text, and so I was really saying to them, like, is this correct? Is this the correct language? Is this the right term? And she was highly uncomfortable, and you know, I can understand again from a legal perspective, probably didn't want to be seen to be giving advice on self-surgery. And so, you know, even in the making of the work, I was hitting up against this issue, and it felt like a productive or kind of exciting place to be. But in terms of making the film, I wanted to put a certain level of onus onto the viewer in encouraging this sense of you have to ask to watch it. I think it was my way of just toying with the way that I was trying to find this information, and also the kind of potential harm. I mean, I find it a little tedious to talk about kind of liberal ideas of consent and harm in an artwork, but at the same time, this work is deliberately pushing at that, right? I like that it feels maybe erotically charged. I like that it feels pornographic, potentially, to watch this information. But what I really like is that for some audience members, it offers liberation, and for others, it's total fear. Like, I love this idea that you could have this total split, that two people could watch this same set of informational slides and be offered either, you know, liberation or terror, you know. Yeah, so the film plays for 3 minutes. It kind of like blasts you a little bit. It flashes at you. And the title "Depollute" is a deliberate upending of this idea of harm, that you know, self-surgery, self-harm, cutting oneself, deliberately mutilating oneself. These things all have these really negative connotations, right? And entitling it "Depollute," I wanted to give this sense of a kind of last-minute flip, a last-minute potential to say, actually, you're freeing yourself. You could potentially be freeing yourself from something that affects your life, you know, negatively. That part, you know, I have my own, again, ambivalence about, because it falls into a slightly, like, tedious essentialist idea about what testosterone does or does not do and who it does or does not free, you know? But maybe in that there's a little bit of admission of like the personal impact for the artist, you know? Like I was on this quest of liberation. I was on this quest of trying to find a way to free myself from my body. Really quickly, and then I'll pass to Panteha, is the other 2 works in the show are called Knife, Scalpel, Blade. It's an ongoing series of photograms, and so that is cameraless photography. It's putting an object on photographic paper, exposing it, and producing an image that way. In these works, I ask friends, partners, colleagues, acquaintances to lend me some sort of cutting device that is meaningful to them. For some people, this has been like a gardening tool. For some people, it's been a literal scalpel. I've had some cooking utensils, some self-defense knives. And so, in a way, with each of them, I'm making just this, it's almost a photocopy, you know, like I blast it with the exposure. It makes like a color field, and you get the white outline of whatever this cutting device is. The sentimental part of me might say it ends up producing a bigger portrait of my extended community. But I also like that it suggests, I don't know, the kind of multiplicitous potential of the cut, whether it's self-harm, self-defense, gardening, cooking, or, you know, the sort of like very, what I think of as very mask thing of carrying around like a utility knife, you know? Like cultures that, cultures that other people engage in. So those are on the far end over that way. I'm going to let that be the introduction. Panteha can talk, and then I think probably we can like unpack things further. Yeah.
So hello, everyone. Thank you, P. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I will also start by talking about the works that are in the show here. The first piece is called A Familiar Violation, and it is an embodiment of this long and ongoing and ever complicating this body of thought that I have around medicalization, but also this sort of entering into a space of looking at what it means to unpack fetishism and to sort of excise, or excising isn't possible, but to sort of take a survey constantly of how the machine of fetishism is functioning, and how the disabled body is sort of twisted and, you know, bloody and gory and caught up in all the cogs of that machine and churned out and taken back in and chewed up and spit out again. And it does really feel like I needed to learn, and I needed to sort of reframe my own understandings of violence, of violation, of pain, of pleasure, in order to truly be able to sort of like delve into my own vulnerability and in making these works. And I think that as a body that is medicalized, and I've known nothing other than an existence that is medicalized. It has really sort of heavily impacted my notions of control and consent, and has given me such a staunch understanding of how the power differentials between those bodies in hierarchies of otherness, how power is exercised, and how violation is such a quintessential part of existing as a medically othered body. And within disability and my experience of disability and within my experience of illness, there is this notion of objecthood. But even more into that, there is a sense that the body, once it enters the space of being labeled as sick, as a sort of sick, disabled thing, how the politics of the consent around that body and that body's ability to consent and move through consent and move through control changes so quickly, so distinctly, so radically. And I think that the disabled body and the ways that it is often defined as something that cannot exercise and should not exercise a fully autonomous notion of consent is really crucial to acknowledge and to bring into our understandings of how we collectively are conditioned, just looking through an able-bodied lens, being forced into an able-bodied perspective to contextualize and treat the disabled body. And that goes from all levels. That goes from the notion of this sense that there is a gaze, the able-bodied gaze, the able-bodied onlooker, spectator that is ever present for the disabled and sick body, that is inescapable, and how that can manifest in simply someone asking you, or, you know, oh, what is wrong with you? Or the idea that there's a singular notion of the body that you must adhere to, and this idea of getting better versus getting worse, all of these things, the idea of the medical decision, the idea of what you are expected to put your body through, the way that you are expected to define your body. Yes, these all lie at the surface, but beneath that, within this idea of a stripping of consent, is this crucial and very quintessentially human practice of searching for those places of vulnerability within other bodies and drawing from that a very fervent sense of pleasure, and a very distinct notion of pleasure that comes from the fetishizing of the othered body, that is deeply complex and is often shrouded in a shame and a secret, and is very difficult to put language to. But all of that exists very innately, even in those individuals that would proclaim to have no fetishistic relationship to the disabled body at all. And yet, the way that we are conditioned, the language that we are given to speak about disability, to speak about illness, to speak about a corporeal otherness, is innately linked then to a fetishistic idealization, conception, and understanding, handling of those bodies. And then you delve even deeper beneath that, as I've done in my work, and you know, the research that I've done into how the disabled body is conjured within the pornographic, within the explicitly erotic, within the explicitly fetishistic, fetish material, and you see within that the disabled body is proclaimed the most valuable when it is the least consenting to that which the able body would wish to exercise upon it. Whether it is an explicit violent sexualization, explicit fetishistic exploitation of a vulnerability, or whether it is within a medical space that is proclaimed as safe, as clean, as professional, and what violations occur under the clinical light in the hospital bed. So, yeah, that's kind of what think about that. And so I made this piece. Yeah, and in a lot of the pieces that I make, I use these cast parts of the body. And I was having a lovely conversation actually with someone before the show about this notion of disembodiment. And I, my practice is inextricably linked to my hyperpersonal experience. Like, it's never able to be untangled from that. And I think that it's very important for me to consistently navigate discomfort within my own work and navigating, what languages of vulnerability that I'm speaking. But I think that denying a corporeal wholeness and sort of like a complete anatomical legibility in my work is very important to me. And in fact, like bringing forth like what I proclaim to be like an anatomical representation that is completely separate from like a legible anatomy. And I think that this is very important to me in thinking about legibility. I'll actually go on to my, oh yes, there's just some graphics that I made. I'll come back to these if I need to, but I want to go to this piece, which is also in the show. But thinking about this idea of legibility, or this idea of like a proclamation of corporeality that is abstracted, but more intentionally sort of set in a like object hood. And so like seeing within this a scene of clinical care or the medicalized body, and not reducing perhaps, but bringing a sort of language of violence into these representations that to me actually hold a lot of whimsy, but are also sort of like meant to be quite disconcerting or uncomfortable. And I think that those two things are not mutually exclusive, a whimsy and a discomfort. And I think that that's, for me, something really important to continue to sort of like navigate in my work. But this idea of examination, this idea of displaying, and all of that being very consistent in the sort of three pieces that I have in the show. And then, going on to the gag piece in the show, necessary measures, and thinking then more about these, I think there's a lot of implications of sort of BDSM or kink in my work, but there are pieces such as this one that sort of more explicitly or clearly articulate that I am, wanting to articulate power differential in a way that isn't so binary, and to question the compartmentalization that we really are so hungry for, just simply for our own comfort, and simply to lull ourselves into a notion of feeling as though we do understand something that perhaps will never truly be understood, and in its essence, denies a full and comfortable understanding. And one of those things is the relationship between the disabled body and those bodies that are tasked with caring for it. It is simply something that cannot be reduced to simple definitions. And so much harm comes from the way that we speak about these things in simple definitions. I am just your doctor. I am just your hospice nurse. I am just your caregiver. I could go very in depth into the sort of like deeply complex nature of the relationship between the caregiver and the body that it's tasked with caring for. But there is already an intense power differential between the able body and the body that then lies on in the hierarchy inherently beneath it because of its existence with physical difference or with a corporeal difference, with a disability of any kind, an illness, a combination of all of those things, an existence that is in the definitions that we wish we could speak about the body, in the definitions that we are taught to speak about the body. These other bodies are so complicated and they refuse a sort of simple and comfortable language. But we can say, disabled thing. That disabled thing, which requires an intervention, requires a help. And as I mentioned, the sort of like stripping of consent that comes with your legibility as a sick, disabled thing, that also is super present in dynamics of care, where the caregiver is proclaimed to not just know what the disabled body needs, but to know better what the disabled body needs than perhaps the disabled body itself. And the autonomy of the disabled body is something that is very uncomfortable and does not, again, adhere to a simple language or set of instructions. And we see the disabled body as something that has a obfuscated autonomy. And so the caregiver comes in and is placed as a sort of like, the able-bodied handler of the disabled body. And that relationship is super complicated. I myself have a romantic partner, who is also my primary caregiver. And that dynamic, while extremely common, is also highly taboo. It is highly taboo. And looking at a piece like this, and sort of labeling these works, labeling this as sort of a necessary measure, the idea that the patient should be gagged, and in that gagging is also this idea of care, because the idea of medication, medicating, the idea that if you are not pursuing a sort of explicit, altering of your illness, of your ill body, of your disabled body, whether it's through, medical intervention, and seeing that as necessary as you navigate these spaces of otherness, and that being a sort of singular language that you're expected to navigate. So that is like right at the forefront of this piece, but really it's thinking about this idea of control and of the patient as a fetishistic object, and looking again at how the body that is laying out and cut open, and how the proverbial wound is also treated as fetishistic opening, as whole to penetrate. You see that these pieces have a dialogue for me in that way, where it is this idea again of displaying of this idea of the body that is rendered inert somehow through its state as incapable, enable, the idea of inability, and how we take that idea and instead of allowing a flexible, malleable emancipating definition within that, we hold on to it and we use it to push down the body and to hold it open and to find the ways in which we can insert ourselves into that body, whether it be a violent sexual insertion, whether it be it doesn't even, we're not even talking about a physical penetration here. I'm talking about the way in which the able-bodied gaze is a knife that cuts in, and how we reach into those holes and we draw out what we need from that body. And how that sexploitation, that violent, virulent, fervent, frenzied fetishization is relegated to those unseen spaces in those shadows in which we are so comfortable to not gaze into, and yet we can step into as those privileged bodies and then step out of and leave those bodies, those other bodies, those sick bodies, those disabled bodies that are now just the holes that you have bore into them in those spaces. You see it in the hospital. You see it in the most passive interactions between the able body and the disabled body. And then you see it in, of course, the more explicated instances of fetishization. And I have watched a lot of disabled porn. I have seen a great deal of the explicated sexualization of the disabled body. And the pattern that occurs in those spaces reflects so directly, so clearly, so harrowingly our larger relationship to the disabled body. What I see again and again in disabled porn, amateur, proclaimedly amateur disabled porn, mind you. Again, I like to say it's not bang bros I'm talking about here. Home videos. What I see is this pattern of caregiver exploiting their disabled ward. It is for your pleasure, a violation of consent. And it's very fascinating to me in the way that it differentiates itself from other explicitly fetishistic and pornographic violations of consent that we might see, because this is actually a very comfortable violation of consent. Even though for me it is incredibly uncomfortable, and I think for most people, it can be incredibly uncomfortable to watch a video of a disabled man being woken from sleep by his able-bodied female caregiver giving him a hand job. The discomfort of that is in our discomfort with sexuality sort of as a collective, but what that action and what the context of these and narratives of these pornographic videos that I have watched in my research and otherwise speak to is how comfortable we are with the disabled body being in a position where its consent is being violated, or where the decisions about its consent are out of its hands. We are so comfortable when the disabled body is being handled. We are so uncomfortable when the disabled body is proclaimedly loud in its existence. You look around to see where is the able body managing this disabled body that is disrupting this able-bodied space. The disabled body exists as a fundamental disruptor in able-bodied society because we are, on every level, living in a society that is acutely hostile to the disabled body, hostile architecture, language that is hostile in its absence of a lexicon that is accommodating, that is wide enough to hold space for the body, to have a soft place for it to land. It is hostile in every way, and so the disabled body is relegated to the shadows, and it is kept in the shadows. It is expected to reside in a domicile. You know, it is expected to reside in a hospital space. There are comfortable places for the disabled body to be, but all of those spaces are outside of our view. The proverbial broom closet that the sick and disabled body is expected to be shoved into for the sake of an able-bodied comfort is where the disabled body must remain. This cycle of alienation keeps the disabled body a sort of horrifying myth. It is uncomfortable and shocking for so many, just in the way that we are conditioned to encounter a disabled body that is out and about in the world. It is an anomaly, and yet illness and disability is not taboo to the world, in the sense that so many people are living with illnesses and disability personally around them, invisibly. And we are given such a limited lexicon to exist in. You must be definable comfortably. I must be able to look at you and understand exactly what you are. And that speaks to all otherness in the sense that we demand a comfortability immediately. I must understand what you are so I can understand how to navigate you comfortably for my sake. Because it is uncomfortable to explicitly come upon those things that bring forth immediate discomfort. Or a discomfort that is buried so deep, is worming so deeply within you that you don't even know how to fish it out. But we are taught to handle those bodies that in their existence perhaps call for, beg for a tenderness. We are conditioned to handle those bodies so violently. And I have, I want to speak together. So
yeah,
but
thank you. Jeanne and I are going to join, and yeah. I want to return to your kind of provocation at the start, and saying I think this is. What did you say?
What, the antagonistic panel?
Yes.
I wanted to say one quick thing about self-surgery that you were talking about, that I just wanted to quickly mention this, that like in my research, in my delving into sort of like disabled porn and like these more like explicit spaces, it was actually triggered by my like coming into and exploring this faction of disabled fetishism, which is like wannabes, like people whose fetishistic relationship to the disabled body manifests in a desire to like disable themselves or to become disabled, or feeling as though like the true state of their body is one in which that is disabled. And so there's communities of people who perform amputations on themselves, and it's a community that has been really difficult for me to like infiltrate and explore, because it is such a heavy taboo, and it is so like, it's like buried in forum into form, and then, you know, I'm on something where it's like I actually need dial-up to access this form. It's like simply not possible on a normal computer. But and
There's actually an essay about that. Hill, do you remember the name of it's like an Australian, you know what I mean? There's this like somotechnics like element of like Australian trans theory and this essay that's about the relationship between selective amputation and trans politics, and if there is some kind of, you know, alliance or disjuncture there. We're gonna find
it.
Oh, yeah, someone, yes.
Yeah, but I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how, in a way, one could argue that that is the trickle down of this ableist gaze that really reaffirms and reasserts at all times that wholeness is the only way to be, right?
Yeah.
That to want to excise or to lose some part of yourself is the greatest taboo or something, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. The idea of wholeness that is so even like marketed to everyone, like the able-bodied standard is wholeness, and I have always really struggled with this idea of the subtractive notion of illness or disability, where it's like you are literally, if you think about like the idea of like being lesser, like it's such a like easy language to reach for, but it's like that the disabled body is an able body that has just had like essential parts of it like carved away, or that like trans bodies or queer bodies are like, there is a normalcy somewhere, but like some essential part that would make you be heteronormative, that would make you fit into the hegemony, has been like carved away or like like, you know, like I think that within illness there is this idea that you should strive for that wholeness, and that there's like a shame in either like reveling in your incompleteness, or like you're rejecting altogether the idea of wholeness.
Yeah, and what it makes me think of is that one of the most sort of pervasive, I would say, transphobic rhetorics is around reproduction.
Absolutely.
That to reject or to complicate or to give up one's capacity to reproduce is the fundamental tenet of what makes transness wrong, and by extension, any other form of debility or disability that might render you unable or unwilling to reproduce.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And I think that in the sort of castration of the disabled body that happens, where it's so taboo to like sexualize a disabled body, to sexualize a sick body, like there's like such a deep and inherent wrongness in doing that, is really attached to the idea that the disabled body is like seen fundamentally as incapable of producing and reproducing, not just because we associate a sort of like innate sterility with the disabled body, or like it is like just othered in terms of its existence, but the idea that you wouldn't want to reproduce with a disabled body, this like idea of a clean, right, healthy society where a lineage must stop with the othered body, and cannot continue, should not continue. And you know, like when I found out that I was sterile because of my illness when I was like 11 years old, it was like a celebration for me. It's like, you know, I wanted to throw a party, but I think that it also really helped me like define my relationship between my gender and my disability and my illness, and how through like an abstraction of my body, my physical body, simply because it like could not adhere to normative bodily standards, I was also able to like more easily find a liberation in my gender, in not being able to adhere to that, because the idea of femaleness or maleness was simply like inaccessible to me, because of like things within my physicality, things within my hormone levels, things within that. But it's like the disabled body, the trans body are often treated as alien in that way. And I am so obsessed with like a total embrace of that. But I think that, of course, like everything that we're taught is to sort of like reject or reach for a fix or a solution to that, you know?
I want to also leave some space for folks to ask questions. We have people walking around with microphones, so maybe as people are kind of generating a thought or a question, I'd love to kind of think about something that both of you kind of alluded to. P, you use this phrase, the multiplicity of the cut, and then Panteha, you talked about kind of legibility and incoherence, and I thought kind of between that space around, and also the able body as a knife, there was just like a resonance in that moment, and I wonder if y'all could kind of like think across that idea of the cut in all of its kind of angles and balances. And then if folks have, throw your hand up. And okay, yeah, we've got somebody right back there.
Right now. Hi, oh my God, thank you both so much for just these incredible, corporeal, viscerally affective talks and dialogues and engagements and vulnerabilities. Just everything you spoke to and your delivery of everything that you shared, Panteha, just felt so poetic, and so I'm just so mesmerized by the languaging and the poeticism of how you conveyed everything. And also thank you for the shout out to our conversation back there, which I'm still marinating in. Right, the discussion we had of these modes of dismemberment and impulse for dismemberment. Right, the ideas around. And language around consent as that which forecloses risk and possibility and potential pleasure derived from pain, and these sorts of sadomasochistic tendencies. I'm again taken back to our conversation and what you shared of your understanding of touch as entangling tenderness and violence, right? And we discussed how part of my approach to understanding touch is holding both an erotic curative capacity as well as a violative potential. And I love your sorts of entanglement and collapse of all of these phenomena. And so I'm wondering, I'm returning back to this sort of investment in the dismembering of a body, right? And your refusal of granting a corporeal anatomic form. I'm really struck by this and would love to think further with you, right? Because I'm thinking again of Rizwana Bradley, who we spoke of a little bit, who in the context of Black femininity says that the body is that which cannot be represented. And so how do you represent that which is unrepresentable, right? And Rizwana Bradley also speaks of the cut as well, thinking with Dion Brand, who thinks of a cut in the world and the cut as both a sort of abyssal, both threshold and abyssal limit in the sort of metaphysics of white modernity and anti-Blackness. And so I'm thinking of cut with Rizwana Bradley, with Eva Hayward, who also thinks of cut as a site of regeneration, thinking with Starfish as well. And so, and I'm also thinking, I think, Jeanne, you may have been referencing, or what you said earlier reminded me of a collective and group called Knowledge of the Wound, which is this collective of Aboriginal Australian artists. And in that collective, there's this performance of a ceremonial scarification ritualistic practice in which one of the artists, Norman, actually inserts himself or induces upon himself 147 incisions, this mode of self-mutilation on the skin of his back, to represent those indigenous Australian peoples who had died in prison custody or via police brutality, etc. So I'm thinking of cut across these contexts of colonialism, transatlantic slavery, etc., right? And in relation to dismemberment of anatomical form, and the body is that which is representable. So I wanted to hold this all together because I'd love to think further with you and write about your work as well. So thank you so much for all that you've made generative, pleasurable, painful, and possible.
Thank you. Wow, thank you so much for all of that. I will just very briefly speak on dismemberment and this idea of touch. And yeah, I mean, I think that there is I will never, and I can never, and it's to simplify touch to, again, yeah, that which either hurts or helps is just impossible for me. I think that even in the most violent experiences that I've had in clinical spaces and medical spaces, I cannot stop myself from articulating that violence with it compounding with a sort of like questioning and interrogation, if not combination with this idea of tenderness, whether you are yearning for it, whether you are searching for it in the touch, or whether you have found it somehow. And I think that touching the disabled body is a really interesting concept. I think that in this idea of a broken down barrier of consent, the disabled body is, in the way that it operates, is this like often sort of like a mythical, fascinating thing. It's like the idea of reaching out and touching the othered body is often something that the privileged body feels totally in its right to do. And I think that the disabled body and the sick body is, again, like I said, sort of interesting in the way that its existence is defined by the idea that it requires an external intervention and an external handling. That to be sick or to be disabled or both is to need to be handled by the able body in whatever manner that might be, in it being transferring you from wheelchair to bed, whether it be a simple diagnostic touch, again, whether it be a violating touch, in a diagnostic touch, in a transferring from bed to wheelchair, in a romantic gesture. And in a piece like Familiar Violation, for instance, like this idea of touch is like brought forth through this like exploration or like idea of the orifice and the wound, or but also I think that like in these senses of the idea of pain and the idea of control, for me it's very important to bring forth these representations that articulate the idea of an autonomy in pain that is quite uncomfortable and taboo, in the sense that a body that is in pain might reach for agony as a form of release, as a form of control, and that these ideas of mutilation, whatever that might be, to an able body, something that the disabled body, the sick body, the other body, the queer body is doing to itself might be explicitly and simply contextualized as capital M mutilation. And this inherent wrongness and shame in the idea that you might do something to your body that would bring it farther away on the scale from normative to non-normative, as in terms of the idealized body, that you might intentionally pull yourself farther away from that norm, is so terrifying and disconcerting and uncomfortable. But that mutilation, for so many, is ecstasy. It is pleasure. It is self-actualization. It is reclamation of control, whether it be a simple reclamation of control or a fevered, again, frenzied, desperate reach for something that is other than the violation that is in the hands of those that exercise a power above it. for me, pain is a super, pain is like the thing that lives inside of me and, often is making the decisions for me and for my body, like a companion that I will never shake and have to learn constantly how to like not fight against. But brief moments in which I'm able to control and step into a pain that is fully my autonomy, that is fully in my control, that is fully my desire, is so linked to a ecstatic liberation. And there is liberation in this idea of reframing and relearning pain. And I think that that is something that othered bodies sort of fall into understanding, often quite unwittingly. But to understand and relearn what pain is as material, as language, as therapy, and even just to relearn what pain is as the agony that is being inflicted upon you. And that requires, for me, a sort of poetics around the idea of touch and handling as a body that is manhandled constantly, proverbially and literally, treated like an object sometimes, lugged, handled like thing, simply. More comfortable, it is more comfortable in so many circumstances for me to be treated as object than to be treated as autonomous individual. And so navigating this de-autonomization, a big part of that is also thinking about this idea of the handling of the body. When you are touched, handled, disrobed, stripped, so when someone reaches within you surgically or otherwise,
Yeah, I just wanted to continue from that I think something that both Panteha and I's work is attentive to is a kind of rebuttal to this idea that we're really all suffocated by currently within discourse, which is that care is somehow the solution to what is going on around us, as if some of the most pernicious forms of violence aren't enacted through the caretaker, the family, community, romantic relationships, domestic relationships. It's very easy, and I think most people at some point will experience the moment that care is the place of the greatest violence, and I can't help but always feel suffocated when this idea is repeated endlessly that we just have to care, we need community and care, And so I think both of us in our own ways are trying to to grapple with that in some way. I don't know, Jeanne, Jennifer, if that was...
Yeah, I mean, this is even community and care, right? I mean, the term community, super, necessary word, but it gets defined by who's in community and who's not, right? So a lot of the work in the show is sort of sitting on the boundaries and on the edges of that. And then around care, I just wanted to say, one of the, works in the heart of my hearts in the show is Dottie Addie's Resistance and Refusal Means Consent, which is when you walk in the door, it's actually one of the things in the sight line when you come in, but it's a very small 6-inch square, 3-piece thing, and it's this kind of strange, discomfiting image of what looks like a teenage girl maybe on her belly on a exam table with a medical figure hovering above her, and then this text in the middle, sort of over her torso. And it felt important to have that here because, that work is, we're pinned between USC and UCLA, which are two sites of enormous harm, abuse, and violation that's staged within the context of gynecological care at USC with Tyndall, who was the lone gynecologist for decades, subject to myriads of complaint. And then there was a doctor, I think it was a couple UCLA guys, and one of them was an oncologist. He was a gynecologist an oncologist who was abusing patients in the context of cancer treatment. And this is it's like the antagonism. I was really did you say the antagonist panel? I love that you brought that up. It's almost like a button, like a red flag for me, because in a good way. Because there's a way of thinking about antagonism, which is about, like, in essence, making a miserable experience for the viewer and antagonizing the viewer or the institution that's hosting the work. And I'm referring to Claire Bishop's work in Artificial Hells, and I'd say that's probably a model against which my work is articulated, because, like, there's a kind of a roughness to the life, right? And what it means to actually bring that into the work, right, is hard and can be painful, but many of us seek it out. Like, we want that from the work, right? And I'd say that's true for both of you, is that you produce work that has that full-on kind of intensity, and might be painful in some registers for some, but it's also like this kind of fiery cleansing kind of pain. Yeah.
Can I just say something about the trigger warning too that kind of came up across both of your work, or the idea of consent? Because there's another work that you can all see probably from where you're sitting by Andrea Carlson, which has kind of functioned also like the trigger warning for the exhibition. This is actually the second Andrea. We had to replace the first work of Andrea's because it was a paper that had to take a rest in a dark room. But both of them kind of, both the original work and this one that's here now evoke the museum viewer, the audience, and ask us to think about our kind of like positionality. And so that question of like the trigger warning, and I think, P especially for having to, people I think kind of miss that I think people almost are like, maybe that's the art, like the projector. But it's been really interesting for us because when we go through the tours, we often take the consent. We do it for them. We're like, we're consenting for you now, and we turn it on. But it's been really interesting to see how people interact with that kind of question or invitation.
My favorite are the really kind of straighter, older groups where women take it as an occasion. So it's like cis women are to take it as an occasion to kind of poke at the cis men in the group and kind of like make jokes. And then, because Jeanne's like, the men seem so uncomfortable. I'm like, because the women are all enjoying themselves, like humiliating them, right?
I've definitely had a number of cis men, like, I really think enjoy the pantomime of telling me, like, how squeamish it made them and da-da-da-da-da. And it's a disingenuous gesture. I think it's more about performing gender than it is about genuinely being made uncomfortable by a work,
I just want to touch on, I did something with Jennifer at UCR, and in that talk I was able to just briefly talk about this idea of the phrase "take care of," which I'm so fascinated by, and I come back to a lot in my work, just because it contains like so many multitudes for me, and literally just in terms of like the simplicity of the language that we have, but the idea of like how whether it's about old yellering someone, like to take care of it, take care of them, or about, sexually pleasuring someone, like take care of me, or whether it's, again, this idea of an evocation of like what we would expect to be like a tenderness and sort of like taking care of me. Or again, in a sort of totally professional exchange between a doctor and a patient, or like a hospice nurse and a patient, where it's like, I'm being paid to take care of you. But in all of those things, I think that it's really interesting that there is still a sort of like de-autonomization, that like care becomes synonymous with this idea that like there's a person who's like doing the taking care of, and then there's just sort of like that thing which is there to be serviced. And the disabled body and the othered body are seen as sort of like requiring a servicing. And I think that yeah, this idea that care is so entangled for me with this idea of like an inherent violence and an inherent rendering of the body as something that like requires the hand that reaches in. And yeah, I think that both of our works sort of like are really navigating that idea of like the reaching in or
We have a question coming up. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh yeah, no, please interrupt me.
Hi. Sorry, I'm really curious about a lot of the word choice that's going on because I'm hearing a lot of the disabled body and very infrequently have I heard the disabled person, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that choice.
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, I'll throw like it out there a lot too as well. But I think that, it's a very important distinction to make. I think that it is coming from this reality for me through lived experience, but also through my sort of like scholarly articulations and like the place that I've come to mentally of understanding this inherent or sort of like this objecthood that is fundamental to the disabled body's existence and the way that it is brought forth in sort of all of the contexts that I've been talking about right now. And I think that I am also particularly just like personally fixated upon this idea of like bringing forth the disabled body as like hyper object, like really like pushing into an objecthood, like an intentional even further sort of stripping of this idea of like personhood. And I think that like identity with disability is a really complicated, identity for everybody is a really complicated thing. But to say, the disabled body, it's an experience and it's an existence that is highly essentialized, as is all otherness. But it is also an otherness that sort of necessitates this idea of like hyper individual vulnerability and sharing of experience to broaden our lexicon and our understanding even of what disabled experience is. It's difficult to stitch together an idea of a unifying sense of disability that isn't in itself defined by extremely different experiences, even of the same illness, even of the same disability. And so, within my work, I'm dealing less with the disabled person than I am with the disabled object. And, even in, I have extracted myself a lot from my work. Like my own body as material is something that's really become more easy for me to reach to, or was easier for me to reach to. And so, even sort of like denying my own place in my work, like casting body parts and they are white body parts. My own corporeality isn't even sort of like legible or brought forth in the work, and I'm erecting a sort of like barrier of inclusion even to myself. And I think that that's like, just for me personally, is a really important navigation, a really difficult navigation in my artwork. But then just like in my like thinking, I reach for this idea of like talking about the disabled body as it, or as thing, or as the disabled body in a way that is like, it can be and should be disconcerting, because that is the space in which I am festering and my work is festering.
It's interesting because the question I had for you two was just what you said, is self-defense self-harming? So P brought up and you pointed out the cut. I love that, and about thinking politically right now, right? Like, what do we have to defend on ourselves and for our self-determination? But also it could imply means that will also hurt us and harm us or dehumanize. And your point, right? That you're not using person, and then there's a place in maybe which you're contributing. I don't necessarily think that, but I'm hearing you say that people could be disconcerted by your use of body over personhood. And then also this point that I would like to hear about this opening something that institutions have to do later. So with like the self-surgery, that then you'd have to go to a hospital that would deny you that care. But thinking of that as a political analogy right now in this idea of reckoning and repair, I don't know, there's beautiful anecdotes here.
There's actually, I don't know, P, if you've seen it, but there's a documentary that could be like 15 or 20 years old called Cruel and Unusual, which is about trans women being housed in men's prisons, which is, of course, what's also a new executive order. And it features like several instances of people who are incarcerated, like beginning the process of this self-surgery and having to have it repaired or completed in a place where you're being incarcerated and you're being taken care of, quote unquote, by the state. So
I'm asking a question which I don't really have an easy answer to, but I think that is not true for abortion, right? I think that is not necessarily true. If you try to give yourself an abortion, and you're not, depending on the state, right? That that when you come to the hospital, they have to decide that you are near death before they do an intervention. It's not about completing a procedure. And it's a really important thing to think about too, like when we're talking about like this biomedical, like sort of biopower, right? The introduction to the history of sexuality, where the title for the show comes from, is also the first place where Michel Foucault uses the term biopower. And there's a whole section in that is all about management and care of populations. So it really goes to what you were saying before. But like that, sometimes the logic of like control and extraction that happens around in one zone is like inverted in another. I'm thinking that because they're all, that's one of the things like that's kind of like a kind of Gordian knot in the show is like trans stuff, gynecology, racial capitalism and its cruelties. Like they can't be just put on top of each other. They don't, you know what I mean? They're not, it's the simplest thing to say is they're not the same, but it's also like they kind of turn into each other. That they're the density, they're these really dense intersections where, you understand me.
Yeah, okay, there's a lot of things to pick up on. One that I feel you were just getting to, Jennifer, is maybe this sense that an accumulation of power should not be the goal, right? And you can't lie transness on top of disability, on top of a racialized context, whatever. But something that these categorizations can do is kind of unthread one another in a way that I would argue is necessary. That transness can complicate disability, which can complicate race, which can complicate capitalism, whatever. And that is a greater political goal, maybe, than trying to reify and reinforce and reestablish these categories, right? And although clearly what is happening in the US is abhorrent, I am, I suppose, for a reinvestment in understanding one's own body as volatile, understanding one's personhood as a terrorist, a terrorist assemblage or something, and something. I'm jumping around now, but also I was really appreciative, Panteha, for the opening of the space of desiring for objecthood. That actually it could potentially be very liberatory to say, treat me like a piece of meat, and to see what happens, to see what disruption occurs. It was not a great answer to your question, MPA, but I don't know.
Well, it also makes me think, too, of the question of the body versus the person, and what you were just both saying, that Mel Chen, who's a scholar and theorist that many of you probably know, uses the personal pronoun it. And I think that there's like a space for like deflating personhood and identity with that kind of jarring antagonism. Is that our word for the day?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so interesting examining what happens when there's a prodding at a body saying you are an object, you are a lesser thing, and it flips over and says, yes, I am. Yes, I am. Treat me like it. Step on me, spit on me. I think in so many contexts, but that is a disruption in and of itself. I think that it is, being disabled in and of itself is a radical act, just simply because of the way that the body is treated and understood. But to explore that radicality of turning up the belly that is asked for, show me the underside, show me the weak and soft spot, and turning up and saying, and where's the knife?
Yeah, completely. And and just to end that thought in a way, or for me to take that through, the end goal is abolition, like always.
Yeah.
Abolition to all of these things we're discussing, and that feels what this work opens up a possibility for.
I feel like so many definitions in our current sort of definitions and comfortable understandings of abolition, when really broken down, it's like it is people are begging for a comfortable flying over to land comfortably on the other side in abolition, but we must go through the dark and the deeply uncomfortable and the potentially quite painful. We must go through what will strip us of those safeties that we cling to that allow for privilege to remain so staunchly. And abolition cannot happen without excruciating discomfort, and the othered body knows this. It is in every stitch and fiber of the other body's being and knowing and seeing. But right now, it's like we're in this really difficult place. We've always been in a difficult place, but now more than ever, of where those bodies and spaces of privilege are experiencing a discomfort for the first time. We saw that really heavily in the pandemic, where new notions of safety arose, where suddenly everyone was understanding what it feels like to be unsafe, going out just in spaces, public spaces that are proclaimed to be safe, where the grocery store is antagonistic, where you cannot go to the movie theater without fearing for your health, for your safety, all of these things, a reframing of your relation to those bodies around you as safe or unsafe in totally new ways, whereas, those languages are often so foreign and unnecessary in their belief for the privileged body. And we see that again now, where people are saying, I never thought that this would happen to me. Why is this happening to me? And I think that you can use that to push through, or you can find that there is a fleeing. Again, I think when COVID was happening, I was so desperate for this sort of change in the idea of corporeality to instigate something larger. And I think it did shift something collectively for us, but we have to, again, learn to not flee from those pricks.
Yeah, we're just going to take one question, and then we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow before we break up for the day.
Oh, thank you.
Ashton.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we're getting close to the end of the scheduled time. I was really struck by this phrase from P about the artist as sort of terrorist assemblage, and this recurring theme of this panel as antagonistic. And I wanted to ask, or maybe point to this aspect of your work in this show where people are required to ask in order to view it. The work itself for sure felt antagonistic to me in an exciting way, both as a sensory kind of matter, but also in terms of the content. But this, I hear that required ask being positioned in the kind of language of consent. But the way it hit for me, the way I kind of love it the most, is thinking of it as you making us beg for it. which then which then makes me think about Adrian Piper and these like other histories of making the power dynamics between the viewer and the artist, and also the power and making the viewer do stuff, making the viewer perform for you, perform before they're allowed that look at your work. And as a trans artist, like living and working right now, that feels like really exciting territory to me. And so I just wanted to like make a little room for you to talk about those power dynamics.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I feel like my favorite part of both mine and Pantea's work in this show is that suggestion of like, yeah, you want this, don't you? Probably to that point, I would just say that, you know, desire is one of the greatest political disruptors. We all want things that we shouldn't. We all want things that we wish we didn't want. And sometimes the things that we want will destroy our lives, you know, and probably everyone has some example of that. And so in that sense, you know, my desire for the work is just not to capitulate to thinking of desire as a safe place, you know? That's really it. I think that's all it is.
Thank you. That's really great. And it's very also like very much related to the conversation that will start tomorrow off. Our first panel starts at 1. Is with the artist Al Palomar. It's two artists who collaborate as Al Palomar, and they are here right now, and I'm gesturing towards them. They are the artists behind "Schreiber is a Woman," and this is a work that is all about desire, and then at the root of it is a patient memoir that has actually been a foundation text for theorizations of desire from Felix and Guattari, Sigmund Freud, and a wide range of other thinkers. Schreiber also leads us into thinking about disalienation, the movement to unravel carceral structures, AKA abolition, that this kind of connects up through Daniel Schreiber's historical story of having been in and out of an asylum through much of his adult life. And so El Palomar will be in conversation with Perwana Nazif, who is curated a show that's actually up at Joan. So those who are interested in this story of radical psychiatry in this case in France, but this kind of movement to think very critically about the psychiatric hospital as a carceral structure and the social imperative to work towards dismantling those structures. And there are examples of nations which have actually done this, Italy being one, where they basically dismantled psychiatric hospitals. Our conversation, that's kind of like there's so many things to talk about with Daniel Schreiber, and that is only one of them. And then we'll be closing with a conversation between me, Jeanne, and Riley Snorton, whose book Black on Both Sides is a really important text in Black studies, feminist studies, queer theory, trans studies, so a book that really initiated a lot of new thinking and new dimensions. And so we're going to get to talk about the show and reprise a conversation that we had with Riley in New Orleans many years ago when we were first testing out these ideas. With this, I want to thank everyone for your attention and participation in discussion today, and Peace staff and Panteha Abareshi, two artists whose work I really feel held by. I saw there was this moment where bottoms all looked at each other, and we were like, yes, we know. And I love those moments when they can be peeled out of a little convening. Hi. Hi. Okay, so with that, we'll close today, and hopefully I'll see lots of you tomorrow. Jeanne?
I think we should all go for a drink, eh? Let's thank the artists.
Thank you.